back at the Decatur Library, and this week on Let's Craft Together, we are going to be making this lovely little cactus. I have had a lot of little scraps of fabric left over from different projects, especially from the face masks that I've been making, and I wanted to do something with them that was a little creative. There's lots of things that you can do with fabric scraps, and I wanted to show you today. There are a couple of books that the library has, several books, that could help. Lots of quilting techniques use fabric scraps. So there are a couple books here, like this one, Cut the Scraps, and this one, Scraps Plus One. This is the same book series by Joan Ford. Those both have instructions for what to do with fabric scraps and how to put them together in a lovely way into a quilt. There's also this book called Simply Quilt that has really beautiful things in it for piecing fabrics. One that I really like is this hexagon shape here. So there's lovely things in here. I'd highly recommend getting that. There's also this book called No Scrap Left Behind. That's another one that just tells you how to use scraps, and that's Amanda Nyberg who wrote that one. Also wanted to show you this great book that I have gotten a lot of inspiration from called Make Your Own Toys by Sue Havens. This one's a great book for a lot of different patterns for stuffed toys, like this really cute little hot dog, and other things like a fox and a little rabbit, and just lovely things in this book. And this is the one that gave me the inspiration to make my cactus. But I wanted to do something that was just a little bit easier for this one to show you how to do that. So below here you will find some patterns that I made for the body of the cactus and the arms of the cactus. You're going to want to cut out 2 pieces that are this size and 4 pieces that are this size. You can piece together fabric in any way that you want, using some of the techniques in these books that I just showed you, or doing the method that I'm going to show you today. So what I have done here is I had leftover strips of fabric that were 1.5 inches wide by about 3 inches the other direction. And this little pattern piece is that same amount. So it's about 3 inches by, I want to say 11 maybe a little less. But you can do this in any way that you would like. You could do squares of fabric, you could do triangles of fabric, really any bits of scraps that you have left over you can use for this. What we're going to do is sew it all together first, and then we'll cut it to exactly the right size for our pattern piece here. So again, you're going to need enough fabric for about 10-11 inches by 3 inches, and then enough for these arms that are a little bit smaller than that. So I have them in 2 pieces here, and I have, really 4 of those arms, and I have a bunch of these little scrap fabrics that I'm going to show you how to put all together. The other things that you're going to need today are a sewing machine. You could also hand sew this whole project. We are going to attach the arms and sew up the bottom and do some other things by hand because it just makes the project look a little nicer. You could do the whole thing by hand though. More than welcome to do that. You're also going to need an iron, some pins, a needle, some thread, scissors, and I think that's everything. So let's get started. All right, so I've got my pieces of small fabric here, and we're just going to lay them out and sew them together so that we can make that big portion of our cactus, this big body. You can put these in any sort of pattern that you want. I had more of this green fabric, so I thought, I'll put the green between, just like that. And not as much of this dark green. So I put that there. Let's do another one of these. Something like that. So you can see here I have my pattern lined up how I want it. for the front and for the back. You'll also notice that some of my pieces are a little long here because I just didn't feel like trimming them, because I'm going to trim them at the end once we get this all sewn together, because we're going to want to make one end a little rounded and the other end is going to be flat. I'm going to just make sure that everything is lined up real nicely. So what we're going to do now is take from the top and fold down, nice side to nice side, all the way down. It's hard to tell with this fabric which one's the good side. And just continue in that same way. And then what we're going to do is sew each of these lengthwise. The reason why we stack them like this is so we can make sure that we keep our pattern consistent. And this is something that's not as important for a small project like this, but if you're going to do a quilt, even a small quilt, this is really important for keeping track of where you want your pieces. So let's sew. All right, so I've got my stacks of fabric all ready to go here. And I'm just going to sew down the long length of each of them. You could pin these because they're such a small piece of fabric. I don't really think that it's necessarily essential that you do that, but if it makes you feel more comfortable, please go ahead and do that. We're just sewing down the length. And then with keeping that thread engaged through that fabric, you're going to continue on to the next one. You can lift your presser foot if you need to, get that fabric underneath there. And this is just another quilting technique that's going to keep all your pieces of fabric exactly where you want them, so that you remember what your pattern is meant to look like, and so that you don't confuse yourself. And I'm sewing this at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, or about at my presser foot there. And you're just going to continue with all of that fabric. So what we end up with after we sew is this line of fabric that's all perfectly exactly how we want it. We're just going to snip these apart. Again, keeping that same order that we have. And we're just going to sew again, continuing with our same pattern. Put good sides to good sides. And if you wanted to, you could totally pin this again, though you don't need to. And line it all up. Just like that. You'll have one piece left over if this is the length of fabric that you end up with. So we're going to sew these and then add this one on as well. So I have these two main pieces sewn. I have my little extra piece left over. And again, we're just lining it up. I'm going to sew right there. And I'm also going to add this one to the bottom so that the pattern lines up correctly. So that will go that way. And we'll just sew there, and then we'll have one long strip of striped fabric. So I've got my long strip of fabric here. You can see it's not really lying flat for me, and I do want to do a little bit of trimming, so I have a rounded edge at one of these ends. So I would highly recommend that you just go ahead and open up your seams here and iron them down. You'll probably have noticed too that I did not go back on my stitches as I sewed these sections together. And the reason for that is, first of all, because it's going to be absorbed into the seam when we sew the whole thing together, and because I'm going to trim those edges so it's going to get cut off anyway. So we're going to continue down doing this opening of our seams here. This is also going to help everything to lie a little bit flatter for us when we put everything together, and line up where our seams should be with the other half of our little cactus. So I'm just going to continue with that and do that also with the other side of the body. So now we've got our two pieces here all put together and all nicely ironed down. You can see I've still got these extra bits of fabric off the side here that we're going to trim, and I'm also going to trim this one just to make sure that it's nice and even on the sides, and to make sure it also has that curve at the end. So we're going to pull that piece of paper out, and you're just going to line it up with your fabric here. You can line it up to either end, it doesn't really matter, as long as you do both of the parts the same. You can pin it here and use a pair of scissors to go around, or if you have A ruler, you can also use that, whatever works for you. And we're just going to line it up and do a quick trim. There's not a lot there to trim on this one, so that shouldn't be too bad. And then we'll do the other side. I'm turning it around because I'm right-handed here. And we'll trim on this side too. Again, there's not much there to trim. This one will be worse for that. And then I'm going to line it up one more time here. Again, you can pin this down or you can hold it down like this and just cut around that rounded area there. And you're going to do the same thing with the other side, and then we'll put it all together. Alright, I've got my two pieces here. I'm going to put them face to face, so nice sides to nice sides. And what you're going to do here is try to line up as many of those seams as you can. I think some of my fabric wasn't quite the right width for this, so they don't match up perfectly, but it doesn't really matter. So I'm just pinning it down, matching it up as well as I can. And what we're going to do is sew around the perimeter of this whole thing and leave some space here at the bottom for us to turn it all the way inside out and then to stuff. So I'm sewing around the perimeter of our cactus here. And what I like to do when I'm sewing this kind of thing is start right before the corner so I don't have to hand sew that corner. So if you start right before the corner and go until just a bit after the corner, that's going to be your best bet for putting everything together later on. And I definitely would recommend going back on your stitches here because that edge there is going to take a lot of stress as we turn this inside out. So we're going to turn with that pivot there. We're also using a 1/4 inch seam allowance here. And we're just going to keep going all the way around. We're also going to sew up the arms of our cactus here. So we're going to do nice side to nice side on both of these. And then what you're going to do is just sew around the edges, leaving this end open for you to turn in and for us to stuff. So we're sewing up the arms. I just put a couple of pins down the center of my arms to hold everything in place as I'm going around. I don't even remove them though as I sew because it just holds them fine, and because it's such a slender piece of fabric, I just find that keeping those in there is a good idea. We're doing this at a 1/4 inch seam allowance again. And just be patient with yourself as you're going around these corners. It's a little tricky to get them just right. So go slow, be patient with yourself. I've also noticed that I tend to use the presser foot lift a lot to sort of adjust how my fabric is lying. You always want to have your needle down in your fabric when you lift your presser foot to make sure that your stitches are still going to be even as you go around. And again, just be patient as you do this. And then you're going to do it with both of those arms, leaving again that little hole at the base of the arm so we can turn it inside out and stuff it. So at this point you should have 2 sewn arms and the sewn body. What we're going to do is just do a little bit of snipping before we turn this inside out. We're going to snip at these corners. What this is doing is just going to relieve some of the bulk at the curves. And you want to make sure that you're not cutting into your stitches as you're doing this. I'm also going to cut off these bottom corners, again, to reduce bulk in those areas. And then make sure you're not cutting into your stitching. We're going to do the same thing with the arms. You want to cut all the way around really on these arms, especially at these spots that are really sort of sharp corners like this top bit here. So we're going to go all the way around. Also down here. We'll do that to both of them. Then you're just going to turn all of these items inside out. So sort of just work that outer fabric to the outside. You can use your fingers to sort of adjust the fabric as you do this. You can also use, if you have something that's a little bit pointy at one end, like a crochet hook or a chopstick or something like that, you can use that to poke out your corners, especially at this end, because it can be a little difficult to get your fingers all the way down there. That may be possible here. So you're going to open all that out, get your corners nice and out there, and you're going to do the same thing with these arms. These ones I think are a little trickier just because there's less space to maneuver in there. So again, just be patient with yourself and take your time as you do this, and we'll get there. So I'm going to continue doing this, and then I'm going to show you how to do the stuffing. All right, so we're filling our items with, I'm using fiberfill today. You could use lots of different things. If you have rice around, that'll make a heavier item. If you have little beads, really anything. If you're making this for a child, just make sure that it's not something they can choke on. So the secret to getting a good stuff is to break up your fiberfill into small bits and then start stuffing that in small parts. What that's going to do is prevent your stuffing from getting lumpy in your thing. I'm sure you've seen a pillow or other things that are lumpy. That's because they have not filled it correctly. So you're just going to take little pieces, pull it apart, and then stuff it into the very bottom. Especially with these arms, you're going to need a little help. So I have a little crochet hook, but you could again use your chopstick or whatever you use to poke out your corners. To stuff that down, you're going to step from the bottom to the top and just go all the way down there until it's nicely stuffed. You're going to do the same thing with the body of the cactus. Again, breaking up your filling and stuffing it down at the bottom first, all the way to the top. All right, so now that we have the main body of our cactus here nicely stuffed, we're going to take a needle and thread and just close up that little hole down there. So when I do hand sewing, I like to do this method for making a knot at the end, and hopefully you can see that, but all you gotta do is just wrap it around your finger and then roll it and then pull that tight, and it creates a nice little knot for you. So the stitch we're gonna do on this is called the invisible stitch or the ladder stitch. This is also the same sort of stitch that we did for another video that I did about making the little container for small items. So you're going to stick your needle in, pull it out, and then stick your little knot down in there. You can also take a pin and pin that shut, but it's pretty small, so I tend to not do that. That's totally up to you though. All right, so we're going to start this stitch by going along the ridge of one of the sides and pulling it through. Then you're going to go directly across to the other side of the fabric and do the exact same thing across that ridge, and again pull tight. What you're going to end up with is a series of straight lines right across, and that is what creates the invisibility of the stitch. You really won't see it at all. It looks almost exactly like you had stitched it with a machine and turned it inside out. So we're just going to continue in that same way and close it all up. You're going to do this same stitch to close up the ends of your cactus arms, and then we're going to attach the cactus arms to the body of the cactus. Okay, so we're going to attach all these pieces together, and you can see here that I've already attached one of those arms. I also wanted to say that when you're closing up the ends of your cactus arms, you want to tuck in about 1/4 inch of that little end there and use that as your edges to sew from. So I lined this first one up sort of so it's the same height as this top one, And I'm going to do the next one a little bit further down because that's sort of how cactuses look, but you could put them wherever you would like. So when I sewed this end, I used a little bit of extra thread so I would have a tail to leave on there to use to attach the arm to the body. And I'm going to put it right about here. What we're going to do is sew around each side very close to that seam right next to it, around the whole thing, so that we have it here. You can see it's a little flexible, but it's not going to go anywhere. It's very tight in there. So we'll start this by just doing a tiny little stitch right next to that seam, pretty close to it. Pulling that through, and then we're going to use that same technique. Go pretty close to the seam that you've created at the bottom here of the arm. Tiny little stitch and pull it tight. You want to go, so essentially what's going to happen is you'll have a row of stitches close to this edge and a row of stitches close to that edge. So we'll go around the whole thing and pull tight. That way it's going to have a little bit more stability than if you did one row of stitches right along the actual edge there of your seam. So we'll just continue in that same manner, and I'll show you what to do when we get to that end there. So I'm now at the end of the arm, and we're just going to use that same technique of those tiny little stitches. I believe this is called a fell stitch, to go around the bottom corner here. So I ended coming out of the arm itself, so I'm going into the body to do my tiny little stitch and attach it. We'll go around to the other side, and you can see that's very floppy because we've only had that one side sewn, so that's why I recommend doing both sides. So once we're around that corner there, we're going to do the same thing, our tiny little stitch, alternating between the arm and the body. Just like that, until we get all the way to the top of that arm. So I've gone all the way around my arm on both sides, and I'm just going to do a couple of extra stitches right here at the top to make sure that my stitches are nice and tight in there and everything is secured well. So let's say about 2 or 3 little stitches just to secure everything down. Hopefully you can see that. And then when we're finished there, all you're going to do is take your needle and put your thread right down into the body of your piece here and come out really anywhere. All that we're trying to do here is just tuck that little end of fabric, your thread into the piece so we don't have a thread end coming out of one of the sides. And just pull it a little tight, snip it, and it's just going to be absorbed into the body of your little cactus, and we're not finished there.